I will remember that sentence for the rest of my life. Not because it was the most beautiful thing any woman has ever said to me, but because of how she said it, like she had been tired for a long time. Tired of waiting for something she had no proof would arrive. Tired of being the woman who believed in quiet things. And then, on a Tuesday, in the gold light of an October afternoon, she said it without any warning, and I did the only thing I could do. I didn't look away. She looked into my eyes and said, "I prayed someone like you would find me." This is the story of how Abigail Marsh came to live on the eastern edge of my life and how, long before she ever said those words, I learned the only lesson worth learning in this world. That the people who are searching for you are not always the ones you expect. They are sometimes the ones who, when you finally see them, you realize you have been on your way to for years. Abigail Marsh was 34 years old when her husband was killed on a Saturday in May, 18 months before I ever spoke to her. His name was Thomas Marsh. He was a farrier from Pueblo. He was 6 feet tall, broad through the shoulders, and quiet in a way I would later recognize as the same quiet that lived in his wife. He had beautiful hands, strong hands, with knuckles the size of walnuts and a thin white scar running across the back of his left thumb where a mare had bitten him when he was 19. He had been shoeing a horse on a road 3 miles south of Telluride, when his wagon went over a loose stone and the wheel struck him in the chest. He was driving home from a wedding. He was 41. When Thomas died, Abigail kept his tools. 18 horseshoes in a wooden crate, for pairs of tongs, a hammer he had used since he was 23, and a leather apron with a small oval burn just below the second pocket. She kept the crate in the small shed behind the kitchen. She did not, in the year that followed, try to sell it. She did not give it away. Sometimes she stood in the doorway of the shed and looked at it the way a woman will look at something she is not yet willing to touch. She was not, on the outside, the kind of woman who invites being worried over. She was slender, 5'6", with brown hair she kept pinned in a low knot at the back of her neck. Her eyes were the color of creek water after a long rain. Her hands were smaller than her husband's, but just as capable. She was a schoolteacher, a woman accustomed to standing in front of a roomful of children whose families did not always agree with her, and she had a voice that could carry across a field. She wore brown dresses with long sleeves, high at the neck, full at the skirt, and either black or tan work boots with one extra hole punched into each strap, which she had done when she was pregnant, and her feet had never quite returned to their old shape. She had one child, a girl named Ruth, who was 9 years old when her father died. I did not know any of this when I first saw Abigail Marsh. What I knew was almost nothing. I knew that a landowner 2 counties over had advertised for someone to repair the south boundary fence of the ranch he had just purchased. And I knew that the advert had included a line at the bottom about a widow in town who could use a hand with a small job of work every now and again if the right man came along. I knew that the right man was not me. I am 38 years old. I have a handsaw that has been in my family since my grandfather, and one good skill in this world, which is the ability to mend the things that have been broken in the ordinary way. I had never married. I had once been engaged to a woman in Durango, but she had changed her mind, kindly, with a letter, and I have never blamed her for it. I lived alone on a small piece of land southwest of Silverton with a chestnut mare, a dog named Bo, and 73 chickens, of which I was inordinately fond. My name is Ethan Calloway. I was not in love before I met Abigail Marsh. I was also not in love. I was, if I am being honest, in the long waiting room of my own life, sitting in a chair by a window, watching for a name to be called that had not yet been called. I drove the wagon north on a Tuesday in late August. The drive from my place to hers was 11 hours if I did not stop, but I stopped twice, once for the mare and once for a sandwich I ate on the tailgate under a cottonwood whose leaves were just beginning to turn at the edges. When I got to Telluride, it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The light was that particular mountain light that comes in the last hour before sunset, where every rock and roof is touched first with honey and then, by the time the shadows stretch, with something darker. The mountains around Telluride go pink, then gold, then a kind of soft bruised blue that is too gentle to be called purple. I sat in the wagon and looked at them and thought, for no good reason, that Abigail Marsh was probably already making supper. There was a woman at the wash basin behind the schoolhouse. That is how I found her. I asked a boy with a stick where Mrs. Marsh lived, and the boy pointed across the field to the basin. I went and found her. She was bent slightly at the waist, her sleeves rolled to just below the elbow, scrubbing a brick. When she heard my boots on the grass, she straightened up. She looked at me the way a sensible woman looks at a stranger who has come to her back door at the end of a long day. She was polite. She was not warm. She was, I would later learn, very rarely warm to anyone she had not known for at least a year. I told her my name. I told her why I had come. I told her that the previous owner of the south fence had been a man named Louis Roan, and that I would be replacing the broken stretch, which I had measured to be 86 running feet. Abigail Marsh listened. Then she said, "If you're Ethan Calloway, you're the one that put a new shake roof on the Haskins place last October." I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Mrs. Haskins said you didn't take a cent." I did not correct her. I had not, in fact, charged the Haskins place. Mrs. Haskins had paid me in apple butter and a ham. Abigail Marsh, who was a woman who loved a true sentence, smiled for the first time and absolutely. I did not know, at that moment, that I would live the rest of my life for that smile. I did know I would remember the angle of it. That evening Abigail fixed me a plate. She did not invite me in for supper. She brought the plate to the porch and set it on the rail and went back inside. The plate held 2 eggs from her own chickens, a slice of bread I could tell had been baked that morning, and a small piece of salt pork she had clearly fried the moment she saw me drive up. Ruth sat on the porch step the whole time and watched me eat. Ruth was a small girl. She had her father's broad shoulders and her mother's long brown hands. She was 10. She asked if my name was really Ethan, and I said it was, and she said, "Are you going to live here?" I told her I was not. She said, "That's too bad." Ruth had the gift of being direct, which is a thing city children lose and ranch children do not. I left the next morning to drive the 11 hours back to my own place. I thought about Abigail Marsh every mile. I came back in 3 weeks, in the middle of September, to repair the small job of work. The job turned out to be a porch step. The step had rotted out in the middle, and anyone using it had to step over the hollow part, which was a hazard for Ruth. I brought cedar from San Juan County. I measured the broken joist, which had been broken by Thomas himself one winter when he had gone out to clear snow from the porch and the axe had slipped, an injury he had not told his wife about because Thomas was the kind of man who did not want his wife to worry over a thing he could mend. I replaced the joist. I replaced 3 boards. I sanded the rest. I left the porch step the way a porch step should be. Level, true, and forgiving underfoot. Abigail paid me $2 in silver. She paid me with the careful, slow motion of a woman who wanted me to understand that the money meant something to her. I understood. I took the money. I told her I would come back at the end of October to look at the windows in the kitchen, which had begun to rattle in the wind. She said that would be a kindness. The end of October. That is when she said what she said to me. Because I had come. I had said I would come, and I had come. I tell you this because in my life I have walked into a great many rooms where a great many people were waiting, and I have learned that the people who are not sure whether what they need will arrive are the most fragile people on earth. They are the people you must, in this life, answer if you say you will answer them, because they have made a small bargain in their hearts, and when you arrive you have either honored the bargain or you have not. If I had not come, Abigail Marsh would have forgiven me on a Tuesday, and she would have kept the rotted window forever. I came. I came on the last Friday of October, 2 days before Halloween. The cottonwoods along the creek had gone full gold, the kind of gold that makes you think the entire world has been dipped in honey for 1 week only and the rest of the year is just an imitation. The light through Abigail's kitchen window on the afternoon I arrived was the kind of light that forgives every house for being a little too old. I went inside. I looked at the windows. I told her that 3 of them needed new putty and 1 of them needed a new pane, because there was a crack running from corner to corner, and I was not going to put new putty on a cracked pane. I said, "I will come back on Tuesday with the glass." She said, "Tuesday is when Ruth has her lesson with the Henderson boy." I said, "Then Wednesday." She said, "Wednesday is when I wash." I said, "Then Thursday." And she said, with a small nod and a thing like a quiet laugh in the corner of her mouth, "I will be ready for you on Thursday, Mr. Calloway." This is what the rest of my life looks like. We sat at her kitchen table. Ruth was there. Abigail poured me coffee. The coffee was weak. I drank it anyway. We talked about the cost of flour, about the price of oats in the county seat that autumn, about a boy named Caleb who had come to school in September without shoes and how Ruth had given him one of her own pairs without asking, and how Abigail had not scolded her for it, because the strap on Ruth's second pair was already punched with that extra hole. Ruth, who was a girl with a sense of humor about the world she lived in, said, "Mother, if you give away all my shoes, I will have to go barefoot until spring and you will be sorry." Abigail said, "I will be sorry only if you give them to boys who refuse to grow." We all three laughed. It was a small laugh. It was the right laugh. I went home that night and thought, for the second time in my adult life, that I would like a wife. In November, the snow came early to the mountains around Telluride. It came the second week of the month, the way it had come when Thomas was alive, before Abigail had ever had to consider what a winter without him would look like. I drove up on a Thursday with a load of firewood, which I had cut from a stand of dead cottonwoods on my own place. The firewood was good dry cottonwood, which is a wood that burns hot and smells sweet. Abigail met me at the gate. Her face on that morning was a face I had not seen before. It was the face of a woman who had been awake all night thinking about whether she could afford to ask for help. I did not let her ask. I unloaded the wood. I stacked it. I salted her steps. I told her I would do the same in December and January, if you will have me, and she said with great composure that she would. That is the bargain. Abigail did not know it yet, but I had decided that I would continue to come. Not because I had been engaged to do work and could be paid for it, but because, having been to her kitchen and to her porch and to her gate, I had become the kind of man who is not at peace with the idea of her being alone in November. I will tell you what grief looks like in a small town because I have watched it. Grief looks like a woman who keeps a farrier's crate in the back shed and looks at it through the doorway but does not touch it. Grief looks like a woman who smiles at 10 in the morning because she has decided that smiling at 10 in the morning is something she owes her daughter. Grief looks like a woman who, on a Tuesday, watches the snow fall for 35 minutes while the kettle boils on the stove, and then buries her face in a dish towel for 1 minute, and then pours the water. There is no cure for grief. There is only the slow company of other people who understand, without being told, that you are not yet finished with it. I did not tell Abigail I understood. I did not need to. I had lost my own mother at 15, and I had lost my father at 21, and I had buried both of them within 800 yards of the kitchen in which I had grown up. There are things you do not say to other grieving people. There are only the things you do. You show up on Thursdays. You bring firewood. You salt the steps. In December I came twice. Once to mend the east-facing window in the parlor, which I told Abigail I had decided to put a brand new pane in so you'd have good light. Once to mend the kitchen door, which had warped slightly in the cold and would not shut properly at the foot. I replaced the lower hinge. I planed down the swelling on the door stile by 2 millimeters, which is a number that would not mean anything to most people and which meant everything to Abigail because the door shut again, and a door that shuts is a thing you cannot pay for in silver. The east window. This is the labor I want to tell you about. The parlor window was 8 feet 4 inches across and had been, in Thomas's time, a window that faced west. The west-facing light in this part of Colorado comes late in the afternoon and is good for reading but not for morning. Abigail, who is a woman who likes the morning, had been doing her planning at the kitchen table because the parlor got too dark for her until 5 o'clock. I told her I had been thinking about whether we ought to take the larger of the 2 parlor windows and put it on the east side of the house, where the morning light would come in. She said, "That would be a very great kindness, Mr. Calloway." I said, "Then let us do it." I did it in December on a Saturday. I took the window out of its frame in the morning and carried the frame to the barn, and I cut a new opening on the east side and I put the window in. I sealed the former opening on the west with new siding that I had planed by hand, board by board, until the seams disappeared. When I finished, in the late afternoon, the light came through the new parlor window in a way that made Abigail Marsh stand very still in the doorway of the parlor and look at it for a long, long time. I did not say anything. I let her look. Ruth, who was always direct, said, "Mother, you look like you have just been given a horse." Abigail said, "I have been given something better than a horse." I understood then what a small-town man understands when a widow says in his hearing that you have given her something better than a horse. That is not a declaration. That is not a promise. That is a woman telling you that you have begun to be the answer to a question she had been afraid to ask. In January, a man named Russell Tobin came to Telluride. Russell Tobin was 46 years old. He was a cattle buyer from Pueblo, which is a trade that did not always attract the most patient of men. He had been married twice. He had a small daughter in Pueblo he did not see. He was the kind of man who combed his hair with his fingers and who wore a cream-colored hat he had no business wearing on a ranch. Russell Tobin had come to Telluride because he had heard there was a widow with a small ranch who might be persuaded to sell. He had not yet, when he came to my attention in late January, even met Abigail. He had been asking after her at the feed store. He had been asking after her at the post office. He had been asking after her, with the polite, soft-spoken patience of a man who knew he was doing something improper and was doing it anyway with care. Russell Tobin was not a villain. He was a man who wanted land, and who had decided that the land could come with a wife as part of the consideration. He wanted, when he stood in the feed store, what most men wanted then and most men still want now. He wanted a woman with a clean kitchen and a small opinion of her own and a young daughter who could be raised up properly. He wanted, in short, a future. He simply did not have, at 46, the kind of emotional equipment you would need to imagine that the woman he was asking after had already begun, in her own quiet way, to imagine a different future with a different man. He called on Abigail on a Sunday in February. She told me about it in March with great composure. She told me that Russell Tobin had come to the door at 3 in the afternoon and had said, "Mrs. Marsh, I would like to discuss with you, in a neighborly way, the question of your south pasture." She told me he had been polite. He had offered her a fair price, which she knew was a fair price, because she had asked Caleb Henderson what the pasture was worth, and Russell Tobin had come in just above it. She told me that Russell Tobin had also, as he rose to leave, said, "Mrs. Marsh, if you will allow, I would like to come back to court you in the proper form." Abigail was, in other words, a respecter of forms, and Russell Tobin had come at her in the proper way. I will tell you what I did not do. I did not forbid her. I did not warn her. I did not tell her my mind. I did not, on the Sunday Russell Tobin came to court my almost wife, go to his lodgings and demand a meeting. I drove to Telluride in the middle of March with a small load of cedar. I had told her I would come in March to repair the fence between her south pasture and the Sadowski place, and I had come. I unloaded my tools at her gate. I went to work. She came down to the fence line at 4 in the afternoon. I had been working for 7 hours. My arms ached. She had on a brown dress with a high collar. Ruth was at school. We stood on either side of the fence I was repairing. The fence was on the property line. The fence was in the way that the channel of a river is the line between two different possibilities for the future. On one side of the fence there was Abigail's south pasture, 412 acres of good grass that Russell Tobin would like very much to own. On the other side there was the rest of her life. She said, "Mr. Calloway, I want to tell you that Russell Tobin has courted me in the proper form." I did not say anything. She said, "And I want to tell you that I have not given him an answer." I told him I was waiting for something to come clear. I still did not say anything. Then she said it. She took a step closer to the fence. The light on that afternoon was the kind of golden, low March light that makes the cottonwoods across the creek look like they are made of gold leaf. She said, "I want to ask you a question, Ethan Calloway. Are you a man who comes to help because you've been hired, or are you a man who comes to help because you've decided that, in some way, you've been sent?" I said, "I am a man who has decided that I have been sent." She said, "Then I have something I want to say to you." She stepped closer to the fence, which I had by then mended to a height of 4 feet 6, and which was a fence that could be stepped over, and she did not step over it. She put her 2 hands on the top rail. She looked into my eyes. The creek behind her made the soft continuous sound that the creek makes when it is in good temper. She said, "I prayed someone like you would find me." That is what she said. That is the line. I did not, on that afternoon, do anything foolish or grand. I said, "Abigail, I would like to mend the south pasture with you, in the proper form, as soon as Ruth has had her spring turn." She said, "That would please me." Then she did step over the fence, and she kissed me on the cheek, which she had not done before, and which was the only time in the 3 days that followed that she allowed herself to be a woman without the composure the world has taught her. A woman who has been a widow for 18 months does not become a bride without friction. The friction was not with Russell Tobin because Russell Tobin was a man of form. The friction was with Abigail herself. The friction was that Abigail, on the night she agreed to marry me, sat down on the porch and cried for 40 minutes, because she had promised Thomas, in the summer of his last year, that she would not marry again. I knew that. I had been told by Ruth, 2 weeks earlier, that her mother had made that promise. I did not raise it. I let Abigail, a woman who kept her promises, sit with the friction honestly for as long as she needed to. In April, I went to look at the south pasture with Russell Tobin. I did not raise my voice. I told him, in the most neighborly language I could find, that Abigail had made her choice. I told him she was, in the proper form of the day, going to be my wife. I said, I want you to understand that I am grateful to you for having come in the proper form. I want you to know that, in another season with a different woman, you will likely do very well. Russell Tobin, who was a man of form, said, Then I will not press on the south pasture, Mr. Calloway, and I will wish you both joy of it. He paused. Then he said, with a dignity I have always remembered, I had hoped that the south pasture would not be the better part of the bargain. I see that it is. He nodded. He tipped his hat. He left on the Tuesday stage. That is the friction that the man was given. Other men might have raised their voice. Russell Tobin did not, and the day he left Telluride I respected him more than I respected myself because he had been right in his own way and he had not raised his voice. Then we married. We were married in May on a Saturday, which was the anniversary of Thomas's death, which Abigail had chosen deliberately, because she wanted to honor the day rather than to flee it. The wedding was at the church. The pastor was there. Ruth was there. Caleb Henderson was there. Mrs. Haskins was there. The boy with the stick, who had grown 2 inches over the winter, was there. They were all the people that mattered. We did not have a dance. Abigail had been a bride once before and was too wise to want a dance. We went home after the wedding to her kitchen and ate bread and salt pork and Abigail's apple butter, and we sat in the parlor under the east-facing window I had put in the December before, and we did not speak for 45 minutes. That is what love looks like when it doesn't announce itself. It just quietly faces east. She did not say it again, the line she had said at the fence line. She did not need to. The line was the thing that made it possible for the rest of our life to begin, and a thing that has been said once with full sincerity does not need to be said twice. I will tell you that I have, in the 16 years since, thought of her saying it at least 3 times a week. I have thought of it when the first new calf was born on the south pasture in the spring of the year we married. I have thought of it when Ruth, who had grown up to be a teacher herself, married a man from Durango whose quiet hands looked like her father's. I have thought of it on the morning Abigail died, in November of last year, 2 days after the first snow. She died in the parlor. She died with her face turned east. The east window, the one I had put in the December we became engaged, had been, at the end, the last thing her eyes saw. Grief doesn't leave. It just learns to share the house with other things. I am, at 54, a man who lives alone again, but who has not lived alone for 16 years with anyone but the memory of Abigail Marsh, who is still, in some very real way, the woman who keeps the kitchen warm from the other side of the wall. Ruth lives 2 counties away. She has her own children. The dog, Bo, died 2 winters ago. The chestnut mare is 21 and slow in the mornings but happy in the afternoons, and I have decided that I will not put her down until she tells me she is ready. I will tell you one more thing because I promised myself that I would, and because some promises should be kept even after the person you made them to is no longer here to hear them. In her last week, Abigail made me bring her the crate from the shed. The farrier's crate. I brought it in to her, and she sat in the parlor chair in the morning light from the east window, and she opened it and she took out 18 horseshoes, 4 pairs of tongs, a hammer, and a leather apron, and she told me the story of everyone. She told me which shoe Thomas had made for which horse. She told me the names of the horses. She told me the year, the month, the day of the week. She told me which horses had been difficult and which had been kind. Took her 4 hours. By the end of it, the kitchen smelled of leather and rose water and the kind of late November cold that comes just before snow, and she said, "Thank you for letting me do this." I said, "Abigail, you do not have to thank me." She said, "I want to." Then she said, "Now you put it back." I said, "Where?" She said, "In the parlor. By the east window. That is where it belongs now." I put it back. The crate is here. I have not moved it. There is no good way to end a story like this. There is no large door to walk out of. There is, instead, only the long quiet of a man in a parlor in the morning, with a crate of farrier's tools by a window he put in for the woman who is no longer there to use the light. There is the soft, continuous sound of a creek in good temper, in a season when the cottonwoods are bare and the eastern sky is the kind of soft gray that promises, very gently, the next kind of weather. There is what I learned, which is what I think was the lesson all along. That the people who are searching for you are not always the ones you expect. That the most important labor in this world is sometimes the labor of showing up twice in a row, and then a third time, and then on every Thursday, and then in November, and then on a Saturday in May when the year is just beginning to turn green again. I want to tell you, before I go, that there is a man I have come to know who walks into the kitchen of a widow in Cripple Creek one cold morning, carrying nothing but a hammer and a handsawn plank for her back door that has bothered her for a year. If you would like to hear that story sometime, I will tell you. He has the same hands your father had, if you have a father, and if you do not, I will tell you about him anyway. Until next time, keep riding.